My dad grounded me in front of 30 relatives. Then his lawyer walked in with the truth. My father grounded me in front of 30 relatives. He called me a thief over the Thanksgiving turkey. My stepmother smiled sweetly while I begged him to listen. By December, my name was erased from the family company. 6 months of silence. 6 months of whispered accusations. Then his lawyer walked in carrying a single manila folder. What was inside destroyed the wrong person's reputation instead. My name is Emily Carter, 27. Senior accountant at a firm in Columbus, Ohio. My mother died when I was 16, and my grandmother Eleanor practically raised me afterward, teaching me to balance a checkbook before I could drive. My father Richard remarried 5 years ago to a woman named Denise, who came with a son, Tyler. I still did the books part-time for our family business, Carter and Sons Construction, out of loyalty more than anything. Grandmother Eleanor passed away 2 months before that Thanksgiving, and her estate was still tangled in probate. She'd built a modest fortune buying up rental properties in the 70s, and everyone in the family had opinions about who deserved what. I tried to stay out of it, but Denise made it clear she thought Eleanor's money belonged to the family now, meaning her family too. Richard had changed since marrying Denise. He used to call me every Sunday to talk business. Now those calls came less often, replaced by long silences whenever Denise was in the room. I told myself it was normal, that new marriages needed adjustment. I didn't want to be the bitter daughter who couldn't share her father. So I smiled and made excuses for him. Tyler was 24 and had never held a job longer than 4 months. He drove a truck nicer than mine, wore watches that cost more than my rent, and always had an excuse ready when someone asked how he afforded it. Denise called him entrepreneurial. I called him something else in my head, but I never said it out loud. Not once. The company had been struggling quietly for over a year. Material costs were up, 2 big contracts fell through, and Richard had taken out a line of credit against the business to cover payroll. I knew because I saw the numbers every month. He didn't like me asking questions about it, so eventually I stopped asking and just kept the books clean. Eleanor left behind a locked filing cabinet in her sunroom that nobody had gone through yet. I'd promised her, near the end, that I would be the one to sort her papers when the time came. She squeezed my hand and said, "You're the only one who reads the fine print, Emmy." I didn't understand then how much that sentence would matter later. Denise had a habit of bringing up money at the worst possible moments, over dinner, during holidays, at Eleanor's own bedside near the end. She'd mention how unfair it was that Eleanor left specific properties to specific grandchildren instead of splitting everything evenly. Richard usually just nodded along, too tired or too distracted to push back on his own mother's wishes. I started noticing small discrepancies in the company's petty cash around September. A few hundred here, a few hundred there. Always explained away as vendor deposits nobody could produce receipts for. I flagged it in a spreadsheet I kept for myself, not because I suspected anyone specific, but because sloppy bookkeeping bothered me on principle. Old habits from Eleanor, I suppose. Tyler had started helping out at the office that fall, shadowing the bookkeeper Denise had hired to replace the woman who'd worked there for 15 years. Nobody explained why Carol was let go so suddenly. Denise said it was restructuring. Carol had cried when she told me goodbye, and she wouldn't quite meet my eyes when I asked her why. My cousin Marcus, who worked construction crews for Carter and Sons, mentioned that supply orders had gotten strange lately, invoices for materials that never showed up on job sites. He brought it up casually, not accusing anyone, just confused. I told him I'd look into it. I never got the chance before everything at Thanksgiving blew apart entirely. Richard had always been proud, the kind of man who built something from nothing and never let anyone forget it. That pride made him vulnerable in ways he couldn't see. Denise learned quickly that flattering his legacy, his name, his authority, got her further than any argument ever could. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. I bought myself a used sedan that October with savings I'd built for 3 years. Nothing fancy, Just reliable. I mentioned it at Sunday dinner. Proud of paying cash. Denise's eyebrows lifted slightly. Must be nice, she said, to have that kind of money lying around. I laughed it off. I didn't know she was already building a story. Eleanor's will was set to be formally read in January, once probate cleared. But everyone already knew the broad strokes: the rental property split between grandchildren, a trust for education, and a controlling share of company stock she still technically held, left to whichever family member proves themselves most capable of protecting it. That phrase would matter more than anyone realized. Denise began hosting more family gatherings that fall, positioning herself as the new heart of the Carter family. She was good at it. Genuinely warm in a way that made people forget to ask hard questions. Aunts brought her recipes. Uncles asked her opinion on things. I watched my father's wife slowly become the person everyone deferred to, including him. By November, the missing money in the petty cash account had grown into something bigger, nearly $150,000 unaccounted for across two linked accounts, one tied to the company and one tied to Eleanor's estate. I found it while reconciling year-end statements late one night, and my stomach dropped so hard I had to sit down. I brought the discrepancy to Richard privately on a Tuesday evening, laying out the spreadsheet on his kitchen table. He stared at it for a long moment, jaw tight, and asked me a single question. Emily, did you take this money? Not who took this money. Not what happened. He asked if I took it. Like it was already decided. I told him no. Obviously no. And asked him to look at the transfer dates with me, to figure it out together like we always had. He said he needed time to think. Denise appeared in the doorway right then, arms crossed, saying nothing, just watching us both with an expression I couldn't quite read at the time. 2 days later, Richard called to say the company's outside bookkeeper had found a wire transfer authorized under my employee login, dated back in August, for $40,000 into an account he didn't recognize. I told him that was impossible, that I hadn't logged into the company system in weeks because I'd been locked out for a system upgrade. A system upgrade Denise arranged, I pointed out. Richard went quiet on the phone. I could hear Denise's voice in the background, low and urgent, though I couldn't make out the words. When Richard came back on the line, his tone had hardened. We'll talk about this at Thanksgiving. With the family. Everything out in the open. I should have been relieved. Everything out in the open sounded fair. I didn't yet understand that the family meant 30 relatives gathered in one backyard, and in the open meant a public accounting designed to look transparent, while actually being a trial with a predetermined verdict. I spent the week before Thanksgiving building my own defense, just in case. My Aunt Carol, no relation to the bookkeeper, just a family coincidence, called to warn me that Denise had been making calls around the family, mentioning concerns about my spending habits and my sudden new car. I hadn't realized how far the rumor had already traveled. By the time I heard about it, half the family had already formed opinions. Sophia, my best friend since college and a forensic accountant at a firm downtown, offered to look at the numbers with me. I sent her everything I had, the petty cash logs, the wire transfer records Richard had forwarded, the vendor invoices Marcus had flagged. She went quiet reading through it, then said, Emily, this looks manufactured. Not messy. Manufactured how? I asked her. She explained that real embezzlement usually left a chaotic trail, panic, inconsistency, sloppy cover-ups. This looked clean. Almost too clean. Structured like someone had built a case rather than committed a crime. Someone wanted this money trail to point at exactly one person. I didn't say Denise's name out loud yet. Thought it, though. I asked Sophia to trace the receiving account on that $40,000 wire transfer, the one supposedly authorized under my login. She came back 2 days later with a name that meant nothing to me at first, a small LLC registered 18 months earlier, with a registered agent address that turned out to be a UPS store 3 miles from Denise's old house. I didn't tell Richard what Sophia found. Not yet. I wanted more before I brought anything to him, because I already knew how the last conversation had gone, and I didn't want to hand him a half-built theory he could dismiss as desperation. I needed something undeniable. Thanksgiving was 5 days away, and the clock felt impossibly loud. Tyler texted me that week. Something I hadn't expected. A friendly message asking if I was doing okay, saying he hoped this whole mess got sorted out. It read almost kind, except for one detail that stuck with me. He mentioned the $40,000 figure specifically, a number Richard had told me he hadn't shared with anyone outside the accountant yet. I asked Richard directly if he'd told Tyler about the exact amount. He said no. Hadn't. He'd only told Denise. That should have been the moment everything cracked open for him. Instead, he rubbed his temples and said, "Emily, please. Not more accusations right before the holiday." I felt the ground shifting under me and nobody else seemed to notice. Grandmother Eleanor's lawyer, Martin Whitfield, called me unprompted that same week, saying he wanted to review some outstanding estate paperwork with me before probate closed. Struck me as unusual timing, but I was too consumed with the company mess to think much of it. I told him I'd come by his office right after Thanksgiving. He agreed, sounding oddly deliberate about it. The night before Thanksgiving, I sat in my apartment staring at Sophia's findings spread across my coffee table, feeling something between dread and clarity. Whatever happened tomorrow, I decided I would not cry, would not beg, would not shrink myself smaller to make my father comfortable. I had done nothing wrong. I just needed everyone else to eventually see that too. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of clear Ohio sky that made the Carter family farmhouse look like a postcard. Cars lined the long gravel driveway by 10 a.m. Relatives spilling out with casserole dishes and folding chairs. Kids chasing each other across the frost-stiff lawn. I arrived early to help set up, hoping normalcy might soften what was coming. Denise greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted a beat too long, the kind that felt performed for whoever was watching. "So glad you came," she said, loud enough for my Aunt Carol to hear from the kitchen. I forced a smile and carried my dish inside, already feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes I hadn't even met yet. The house filled steadily through the afternoon. Cousins I hadn't seen since summer. Great uncles arguing about football. My father's business partner Hank and his wife. Even Marcus's whole crew of siblings. Everyone seemed happy. Ordinary. Unaware of the storm gathering underneath the turkey and stuffing. I kept catching Richard watching me across rooms, his expression unreadable, almost sad. Around 2 o'clock, Tyler pulled me aside near the garage, out of earshot from the others. "Look," he said. "Whatever happens today, it's not personal." I asked him what that meant. He just shrugged and walked back inside, leaving me standing in the cold with my pulse suddenly hammering. I should have left right then. I didn't. Dinner was set up in the big dining room and overflow tables in the living room, 30-some plates steaming with turkey, green beans, Eleanor's old sweet potato recipe that Denise had insisted on making in her honor. The irony of that gesture wouldn't strike me until much later. At the time it just felt like one more small wrongness I couldn't name. Richard stood at the head of the table before anyone had taken a bite, tapping his glass with a fork. The room quieted. Expecting a toast, the usual gratitude speech he gave every year. Instead his face had gone rigid, jaw set the way it did before difficult business calls. My stomach dropped. I knew, somehow, exactly what was about to happen. "Before we eat," he said, voice carrying across the packed room, "there's something I need to address as head of this family." 30 Forks paused midair. Denise lowered her eyes demurely, hands folded like she was bracing herself for something painful rather than orchestrating it. I felt every relative's gaze shift slowly, inevitably, toward me sitting near the middle of the table. "Emily," Richard said, and my name in his mouth sounded like an accusation already. "There's been money missing from the company and from your grandmother's estate accounts. A significant amount. Wire transfers under your login to an account nobody can identify. Gasps rippled around the table. My Aunt Carol's hand flew to her mouth. I felt my face burning. I did not take that money, I said, standing up so fast my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood. Dad. We talked about this. I told you it wasn't me. Sophia found evidence the trail was built to look like. Sit down. Emily. He cut me off. Sharper than I'd ever heard him speak to me. Not like this. Not like what? I said, voice cracking despite my best effort to stay steady. You're doing this in front of everyone instead of listening to what I actually found? Denise reached over and squeezed Richard's arm gently, murmuring something too soft to hear. He nodded at whatever she said, and something in his posture hardened even further against me. I've made a decision, Richard announced to the room, and I realized with sick clarity this wasn't a discussion. It was a sentence being handed down. Until this is resolved, Emily is removed from any role at Carter & Sons. She's not to access company accounts, attend job sites, or represent this family in any business matter. Effective immediately. A murmur swept the table. My cousin Marcus started to protest, half rising from his seat, but his mother pulled him back down with a warning look. Nobody else spoke up. 30 relatives. And not one voice besides Marcus's tried to interrupt what was happening. I stood there, humiliated, feeling smaller than I had since I was a child. You're grounding me, I said finally, the word tasting absurd in my mouth for a grown woman. Like I'm 16. In front of the entire family. Without letting me show you anything I found. Richard's expression flickered, something like doubt, quickly smothered. This isn't a punishment, Emily. It's protecting the family until we know the truth. Then let me help you find the truth, I said, my voice shaking now. Tears I refused to let fall burning behind my eyes. I have evidence. Sophia traced the account. It doesn't lead to me. Denise spoke up then. Gently. Devastatingly. Sweetheart. Of course you'd say that. Nobody's blaming you maliciously. We just have to follow the facts. The way she said sweetheart made my skin crawl. I looked at Tyler, who suddenly found his plate extremely interesting, refusing to meet my eyes. I looked at my father, searching for any sign of the man who used to call every Sunday. I found only exhaustion and a stubborn refusal to be wrong in front of an audience. Fine, I said, grabbing my coat off the back of my chair, hands trembling. I'll leave, since apparently that's what you want. But you're going to regret not listening to me today, Dad. All of you are. Nobody stopped me. Not even Marcus. Though I saw the anguish on his face as I walked past him toward the door. I sat in my car in the driveway for a full 10 minutes before I could make myself drive, watching my breath fog the windshield. The warm glow of the farmhouse windows behind me full of a family that had just collectively decided I was a thief without hearing a single piece of my defense. 30 relatives. Not one had asked to see my evidence. My phone buzzed before I even left the driveway. A text from Aunt Carol. I don't believe it. Emmy. Call me when you're ready. It was the only kindness I received that entire day, and I clung to it the whole drive home, replaying my father's face, searching for some version of the scene where he'd chosen differently. Sophia came over that night with a bottle of wine neither of us drank much of, mostly just holding my hand while I cried the tears I'd refused to shed at the table. This isn't over, she said quietly. Whoever built that trail made a mistake somewhere. Manufactured evidence always has a seam. We just have to find it. I didn't sleep that night, replaying every detail. Tyler knowing the exact dollar figure he shouldn't have known. Carol the bookkeeper fired suddenly and replaced right before the discrepancies appeared. Denise's calm, rehearsed grief. Pieces were there. I just couldn't yet see the whole shape of what they were forming. But I could feel it. Circling. Waiting to be named. The following Monday, I went to work at my actual job like nothing had happened, grateful for a place where my competence still counted for something. My manager noticed I looked exhausted and asked if everything was okay. I told her family stuff. Nothing serious. And buried myself in spreadsheets that at least made logical, honest sense to me. That evening, I finally made my way to Martin Whitfield's office, the meeting I postponed because of Thanksgiving chaos. He greeted me warmly, but something in his manner seemed careful, deliberate, like a man choosing his words around a live wire. "Emily," he said, "I think it's time you knew a few things your grandmother wanted kept quiet until now." Whitfield opened a drawer and pulled out a slim folder, Eleanor's handwriting visible on the tab. "Your grandmother came to me 8 months before she passed, deeply concerned about irregularities she'd noticed in the company's books, and in how Denise handled certain financial conversations. She asked me to prepare contingencies. She suspected something wasn't right long before you did. Emily." My hands went cold holding the folder. Inside were notes in Eleanor's careful cursive, date, amounts, questions she'd written to herself about discrepancies in property management fees Denise had started overseeing the year prior. "She never told me any of this," I said. Whitfield nodded gravely. "She didn't want to accuse anyone without proof." "Sound familiar?" "She left specific instructions," Whitfield continued, "tied to the controlling share of company stock she still held at her death. It's not a simple inheritance, Emily. There's a condition attached, one she designed very deliberately, and I think once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why your father was told the broad terms but not the specifics." He explained that Eleanor's controlling shares would transfer to whichever family member could demonstrate, through documented evidence, that they had acted with integrity in protecting the company's finances during a period of dispute. She'd apparently anticipated exactly this kind of crisis. "She was testing all of you," Whitfield said, "without any of you knowing you were being tested." I sat in stunned silence, processing that my grandmother, sharp until her final days, had essentially built a trap for whoever might try to exploit the company after her death. "Did she suspect Denise specifically?" I asked. Whitfield chose his words carefully. "She had concerns about several people's access to funds. She wanted the truth to reveal itself naturally." Leaving his office that night, I felt something shift inside me, not vindication yet, but purpose. My grandmother had trusted me enough, even from beyond the grave, to leave a trail meant for someone like me to follow. Called Sophia from the parking lot, practically breathless. "We need to go through everything again. All of it. Tonight." We spread every document across my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, Eleanor's handwritten notes, the company's wire records, property management invoices, Sophia's forensic account trace. Slowly, painstakingly, pattern emerged, ugly and undeniable. Money bleeding out of both the company and Eleanor's estate through inflated management fees Denise had personally negotiated after taking over Carol's old duties. The receiving LLC Sophia had traced earlier connected, through a registered agent search, to a business address shared with a company Denise had run briefly before marrying Richard, one that had quietly dissolved amid unpaid vendor complaints years earlier. This wasn't Denise's first time around this particular block. My father had married into a pattern, not an isolated incident. I found myself both furious and heartbroken discovering this, furious at the scale of the deception, heartbroken imagining my father slowly, unknowingly walking into a con built specifically to exploit his grief and his pride. Whatever Denise was, she'd studied him carefully first. She knew exactly which levers made him defensive, which stories made him protective, which silences made him compliant. Tyler's role became clearer too. Bank records Sophia pulled, using authorization from my own accounts as a shareholder's relative entitled to certain estate documents, showed recurring transfers to an online sportsbook and, more troublingly, 3 separate transfers to an individual whose name appeared in a local police report Sophia found. A report involving aggressive debt collection tactics. "Tyler owes somebody money," I said slowly, staring at the pattern. "A lot of money. And Denise has been siphoning funds to cover it, routing it through inflated fees so it looks like normal business expenses instead of theft." Sophia nodded grimly. And when the company accountant almost caught it, they needed someone else to blame fast. You were convenient. More than convenient, I said, thinking of my new car. My access to company logins from doing the books. My grandmother's obvious favoritism toward me that Denise had resented from day one. I fit the frame perfectly. Almost too perfectly. Which told me everything about how deliberately this had all been constructed months in advance, waiting for the right moment to spring. I wanted to march straight to Richard's house and lay it all out immediately. But Sophia stopped me. If you go in half-cocked, they'll spin it as desperation. Exactly like they did before. You need this airtight. Signatures verified by a handwriting expert. Bank footage if you can get it. Something Whitfield can present formally. Not just accusations at a dinner table. So I waited. Which felt like its own kind of torture. I threw myself into building the case instead. Hiring a forensic document examiner Sophia recommended to analyze the forged wire authorization. Requesting security footage from the bank branch where the $40,000 transfer had been physically initiated, since digital logins alone could be argued as circumstantial by a good lawyer. The document examiner's report came back within a week, confirming what I already suspected in my gut. The signature on the wire authorization was a forgery, close but detectably inconsistent in pressure and letter formation compared to genuine samples of my handwriting. It wasn't done by an amateur. Whoever forged it had practiced. That detail alone told a story. Bank security footage, obtained through a formal records request Whitfield helped file as estate executor, showed a woman entering the branch on the transfer date wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, an unconvincing disguise that nonetheless obscured her face from casual identification. But the build, the walk, the particular gold bracelet visible on her wrist matched something I recognized instantly. I'd seen that bracelet 100 times. Denise wore it constantly. A gift from Richard on their first anniversary, engraved with their initials. She hadn't even bothered removing it for the disguise. Too confident nobody would ever scrutinize footage from a random Tuesday transaction months old. That overconfidence, I would come to learn, ran through everything Denise had done. Whitfield reviewed everything I'd gathered with a growing, careful excitement he tried to keep professional. This is substantial, Emily. More than substantial. Combined with your grandmother's own suspicions documented months before her death, this paints a very clear picture. He suggested we present it formally, with legal weight, rather than another chaotic family confrontation like Thanksgiving had been. There's a will reading scheduled for Christmas week, Whitfield said. Once probate finalizes, the whole family will already be gathered. I could present the findings alongside the formal reading, in a controlled setting, with documentation everyone has to reckon with, instead of just accusations flying across a dinner table. I agreed immediately. This time, the truth would have structure behind it. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed strangely. A forced quiet settling over the family group chat that used to buzz constantly. Nobody mentioned the blow-up directly, as if avoiding it might make it disappear. My father texted once, a stiff hope you're doing okay, which I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine yet. Aunt Carol called every few days, gently probing but never pushing, letting me know she still believed in me without demanding explanations I wasn't ready to give. Whatever's really going on, she said once. I raised enough kids to know a liar's face. And yours has never been it, Emmy. Her steady faith meant more than she probably realized. Marcus texted me job site photos sometimes. Small normal gestures that felt like lifelines back to a family I still belonged to. Underneath everything, he mentioned once, almost casually, that material invoices had gotten stranger since I'd been pushed out. Nobody double-checking vendor deliveries the way I used to. Small cracks were already showing without anyone else noticing yet. Denise, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying an odd sort of triumph, posting family photos online captioned about gratitude and protecting what matters. Richard smiling stiffly beside her in most of them. I scrolled past these late at night with a strange, Steady calm. Knowing what was coming. Holding my silence like a card I refused to play early. Tyler's behavior grew more erratic as December wore on. A new tattoo. A cancelled family ski trip he'd been excited about. A visible tension in his jaw whenever money came up at the smaller gatherings I still occasionally attended. Whatever pressure he was under hadn't disappeared just because I'd taken the fall. If anything, seemed to be tightening. Whitfield and I met twice more that December. Refining the presentation. Organizing documents chronologically. Preparing copies for distribution once everything came to light. He warned me the reveal would be painful regardless of how it landed. That watching a family fracture publicly rarely felt satisfying even when justice arrived exactly where it belonged. I told him I understood. I didn't. Not fully. My mother's old friend, Patricia, reached out unexpectedly that December. Having heard through the family grapevine what had happened at Thanksgiving. Your mom would be furious watching this, she told me over coffee. She'd also be so proud of how you're handling it. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to say that until she said it. Christmas shopping felt surreal that year. Buying gifts for relatives who'd watched me get publicly humiliated without a word of protest. Knowing some of those gifts would arrive alongside a very different kind of unwrapping at the will reading. I bought Eleanor's usual poinsettia for her grave instead of a gift, and cried harder there than I had in weeks. Richard called on December 20th. His voice hesitant in a way I hadn't heard since I was small. The company accountant found something odd in the fee structure Denise set up, he said carefully. Probably nothing. But I wanted you to know I'm looking into some things myself. It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in the wall. I hope you find what you're looking for, Dad, I said, meaning it more layered than he could have understood. Some small, stubborn part of me still hoped he'd figure it out on his own, sparing everyone the theater of a formal reveal. But I also knew, deep down, that Denise wouldn't let anything unravel that quietly if she could help it. 2 nights before Christmas, someone slashed one of my car tires in my apartment complex parking lot. No note. No explanation. Security cameras conveniently angled away from that specific spot. I couldn't prove anything. But the timing felt anything but random. Sophia insisted I file a police report anyway, just to have it documented for later. I told Whitfield about the tire the next morning. He went quiet for a moment, then said something that stuck with me through the following days. People only escalate to intimidation when they're starting to feel the ground shift under them. Emily, that's not a sign you're wrong. That's a sign you're getting close to something they can't control anymore. Christmas Eve. I sat alone in my apartment with a mug of hot chocolate, rereading Eleanor's handwritten notes one more time, tracing her careful cursive with my finger. You're the only one who reads the fine print, Emmy, she told me once. Tomorrow, everyone else was finally going to have to read it too, whether they liked what it said or not. Whitfield called that night to confirm logistics. The will reading would happen at the farmhouse the day after Christmas, per Eleanor's specific written instructions naming that location and timing. He'd bring the estate documents, the forensic findings, and copies for distribution. Get some sleep if you can, he told me. Tomorrow changes everything, Emily. For better. This time, the day after Christmas arrived gray and still, snow dusting the farmhouse roof where 30 relatives had gathered again. This time for what everyone believed was simply the formal reading of Eleanor's will. Cars filled the same gravel driveway. Casserole dishes gave way to leftover cookies and coffee. I arrived with Whitfield, my presence itself already raising quiet eyebrows around the room. Richard looked surprised, then wary. Seeing me walk in beside the family lawyer rather than avoiding the gathering entirely as I had every event since Thanksgiving. Denise's expression flickered too fast for most people to catch. Not surprise exactly, but calculation. The look of someone recounting variables in a plan she thought she'd already secured months ago. Whitfield gathered everyone into the same dining room where Richard had grounded me weeks earlier. The irony not lost on me as I took a seat near the back. watching 30 relatives settle into chairs still bearing faint memories of that humiliating Thanksgiving. Before we begin the formal reading, Whitfield said, there are matters Eleanor specifically instructed be addressed first. A murmur rippled through the room. Denise's hand found Richard's arm again. That same practiced gesture of reassurance. Though I noticed her knuckles had gone slightly pale gripping his sleeve. Tyler sat near the window, jaw tight, refusing to look anywhere near me. His knee bouncing under the table in a rhythm he probably didn't realize everyone could see. Several months before her passing, Whitfield began, Eleanor Carter came to my office with concerns about financial irregularities within the family company and her own estate accounts. She documented these concerns extensively, dated and signed, well before any public accusations were made against any family member this past November. He held up the folder. Eleanor's handwriting visible even from where I sat. Richard's face shifted, confusion crossing it first. Mom never mentioned anything to me about problems with the company. She specifically chose not to, Whitfield said gently, because she wanted the truth to emerge through evidence rather than family loyalty or suspicion. She built contingencies precisely because she anticipated this kind of dispute might happen after she was gone. Whitfield began distributing copies of Eleanor's notes to each branch of the family. Page after page of dates and dollar amounts tracking irregular property management fees that began climbing sharply the exact month Denise took over those responsibilities from the longtime bookkeeper, Carol. Relatives flipped through pages in growing silence, murmurs rising as numbers sank in around the room. This is ridiculous, Denise said suddenly, her voice sharper than her usual honey tone. Eleanor was in her 80s, dealing with health issues. These notes could mean anything. This feels like a coordinated attack against me, orchestrated by someone with an obvious grudge. She glanced pointedly at me, trying to redirect the room's rising suspicion back where it started. I understand the concern, Whitfield said calmly, which is exactly why independent verification matters here. Not just Eleanor's personal observations. He nodded to me, and I stood, hands trembling slightly but voice steadier than I expected as I walked to the front of the room carrying the folder Sophia and I had built over the past month. On November 19th, I began. A wire transfer of $40,000 was authorized under my company login and sent to an LLC registered 18 months earlier. I want to walk everyone through exactly what we found when we traced that account, because it doesn't lead where my father was told it led. The room had gone completely silent now. I displayed the forensic handwriting analysis first, explaining in plain terms how the signature on the wire authorization showed inconsistencies with my genuine handwriting samples, pressure points, letter spacing, the particular slant of certain letters that didn't match years of documented signatures on file with the company. This authorization was forged, I said. Not by me. For me. Gasps rippled through the room. Aunt Carol's hand flying to her chest. Marcus leaning forward intently. Richard's face had gone pale, staring at the analysis pages like he was trying to will them into saying something different. Denise's expression stayed carefully neutral, but her jaw had tightened into something that looked almost like fear beneath the composure. Next, I continued, pulling out the bank security footage stills Whitfield had formally requested. Is footage from the branch where this transfer was physically initiated. Passed the images around, watching relatives squint at the grainy figure in a baseball cap and sunglasses. Notice the bracelet on the wrist. It's engraved. I want everyone to look closely at it. My Aunt Patricia gasped first, recognizing it before I even said the words. That's Denise's anniversary bracelet. I've seen it 100 times. She never takes it off. All eyes swung toward Denise, who had gone very still, her hand instinctively moving to cover her wrist even though the bracelet wasn't visible under her long sleeve that day. That could be anyone's bracelet, Denise said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence, thinning at the edges. This is circumstantial. Grainy footage and handwriting theories don't prove anything definitively. Richard turned to look at her then. Really look at her. Something shifting behind his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. The first real crack. There's more, I said. And I could feel my own heartbeat pounding as I pulled out the final section of documents, the trace transfers to Tyler's gambling accounts, the police report regarding aggressive debt collection, the dissolved LLC from Denise's past connected to the same registered agent address as the current shell company. Tyler had gone rigid in his chair. Tyler, I said, as gently as I could manage given the circumstances, the money didn't go missing randomly. It went to cover gambling debts. Real debts. With real consequences. Based on a police report from 8 months ago about collection tactics used against you. Tyler's face had drained of all color. His mouth opening and closing without sound coming out. Is this true? Richard asked, turning to his stepson directly. Voice low and dangerous in a way I'd rarely heard from him. Tyler stammered, glancing at his mother for guidance, finding none in her frozen expression. Dad. Richard. He caught himself, the slip revealing more than he probably meant to. It's not as bad as it sounds. $40,000 isn't as bad as it sounds, Richard repeated, voice rising now. 30 relatives watching the unraveling in real time. You let my daughter get accused. Publicly. Thanksgiving. In front of this entire family. While you knew exactly where that money actually went. Tyler had no answer. Staring at the table like it might swallow him whole. Denise tried once more. Reaching for Richard's hand. Sweetheart. We can sort this out privately. This doesn't need to. He pulled his hand back sharply. The gesture more devastating for how small it was. You told me it was Emily, he said, voice cracking. You showed me the wire records yourself. You sat across from me and said her name. I was protecting my son, Denise said, finally dropping the composed mask entirely. Something harder and more desperate showing through. You don't understand the position I was in. Tyler owed dangerous people money. I did what any mother would do. You framed my daughter, Richard said, the words landing heavy in the silent room. That's not protecting anyone. That's destroying someone. Whitfield stepped in then, calm amid the wreckage. There's one more matter I need to address before we go further. He pulled out a sealed envelope. Eleanor's handwriting on the front reading simply, for my son. When the time is right. Richard's hand shook taking it. The room holding its collective breath as he broke the seal. He read silently for a long moment. His face crumpling in ways I'd never witnessed from my stoic father. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She knew. Mom knew something like this might happen. She wrote. She wrote that she hoped I'd trust Emily's judgment when it mattered most. That she'd never once seen Emily lie to protect herself. Richard looked up at me then, tears visible in his eyes for the first time since his own father's funeral years earlier. Emily. I am so sorry. I should have listened to you at Thanksgiving. I should have looked at your evidence instead of standing up in front of everyone and... His voice broke completely, unable to finish the sentence. I felt something loosen in my chest. A knot I'd been carrying for 2 months finally starting to unwind, though the anger hadn't fully drained away yet. Not with Denise and Tyler still sitting there. Still cornered but not yet fully exposed. We're not done, I said quietly. There's still the matter of what happens next. For both of them. Whitfield cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the formal proceedings. Given the evidence presented, and per Eleanor's specific instructions regarding the controlling company shares, those shares transfer immediately to Emily Carter, the family member who demonstrated integrity in protecting the company's finances during this dispute. Denise let out an audible, bitter sound. Something between a laugh and a sob. This whole thing was a test, Denise said, almost to herself. Disbelief and fury tangled together in her voice. That old woman set this whole thing up from her grave. She protected her family, Whitfield corrected firmly, from exactly the kind of harm you were causing it. Eleanor understood exactly what kind of person you were, Denise, long before any of you did. My Uncle Joe stood up abruptly, addressing Richard directly. How long has this been going on? Richard. The bookkeeper. Carol. Getting let go so suddenly, was that connected to? Richard. Still visibly reeling. Nodded slowly. Denise pushed hard for that. Said Carol was making mistakes. I never questioned it. I never questioned any of it. Honestly. And I should have. Marcus spoke up next. His voice tight with restrained anger. The invoices. The missing materials that was connected to. Wasn't it? Vendor payments that never showed up on job sites. I nodded. Pulling one more document from the folder. An invoice trail Sophia had traced showing duplicate payments routed through the same shell company that received the $40,000 transfer. This has been going on for over a year, I confirmed, watching relatives exchange horrified glances around the table. Not just the November transfer. Smaller amounts. Bled out slowly through inflated fees and duplicate invoices, probably to avoid triggering exactly the kind of scrutiny a huge single theft would cause. The full scale of it seemed to land on everyone simultaneously. Denise stood abruptly, chair scraping loud against the floor. I don't have to sit here and be humiliated by a family that never accepted me from the start. Nobody forced you to steal from us. Denise, Richard said quietly, not moving to stop her leaving. Something final and exhausted in his tone. That choice was entirely, completely your own. Sit down, Whitfield said, surprising everyone with the authority in his voice. There are legal matters still to address, and leaving this room does not make them disappear. Given the amounts involved, this moves well beyond a family dispute into criminal territory. I've already been in contact with the district attorney's office given the scale of the fraud. The color drained from Denise's face entirely at the word criminal, her earlier defiance crumbling into something closer to panic. Tyler, beside her, had started visibly shaking, his earlier bravado completely gone. Please, he said, voice cracking. I never meant for it to go this far. I just needed to cover the debt before something worse happened to me. You let it go far enough to destroy my daughter's reputation in front of 30 relatives, Richard said, his voice hardening again. All the softness of moments before replaced by something colder. You let her stand there and get called a thief. In front of family who've known her since she was a baby. That's not a small thing. Tyler. My Aunt Carol reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. The same steady comfort she'd offered through every phone call these past 2 months. I told you I never believed it, she whispered. I squeezed back. Grateful. Though some part of me still felt raw from having needed that reassurance at all. From anyone. In the first place. Whitfield continued with the formal proceedings once the room settled into a tense, watchful quiet. Given the confirmed forgery, the trace fraudulent transfers, and Eleanor's explicit written instructions, I'm recommending immediate legal action to recover the stolen funds, alongside criminal referral for fraud and forgery charges. He looked directly at Denise and Tyler as he said it, his tone unwavering. Denise's composure finally shattered entirely. You can't do this to us. Richard. Say something. Do something. But Richard had gone quiet, staring at his wife like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in 5 years. All the small excuses and explained away red flags suddenly rearranging themselves into an obvious, undeniable pattern he'd simply refused to see. I trusted you, he said finally, voice hollow. I let you talk me into firing Carol. I let you convince me my own daughter was a thief. I signed off on fee structures I never fully understood because you made it sound reasonable every single time. He shook his head slowly. I don't even know who I married anymore. Tyler tried once more. Desperate now. It wasn't all her. Some of it was me trying to fix things before they got worse. I was scared. The people I owed money to had already threatened. Then you should have come to your family honestly, Marcus interrupted sharply. Instead of letting Emily take the fall for your mistakes. The room had fully turned against Denise and Tyler now. 30 relatives who had watched me get humiliated 2 months earlier without protest suddenly finding their voices all at once. A chorus of disbelief and anger directed exactly where it had always belonged, even if it had taken far too long to arrive there fully and completely. I felt no satisfaction watching them crumble. Not exactly, mostly exhaustion. And underneath it, quiet. Steady relief that the truth had finally, undeniably surfaced with evidence nobody could dismiss or explain away. Eleanor had built this reckoning carefully, patiently, trusting that if she gave me the tools, I would eventually find my way to exactly this moment. Whitfield gathered the remaining documents, addressing the room once more. Given today's revelations, I'll be filing formal reports with local law enforcement this week regarding the forgery and fraudulent transfers. I'd advise Denise and Tyler to secure legal representation of their own moving forward. His tone remained professional, but there was no mistaking the gravity underneath his words. Denise turned to Richard one final time, voice pleading now. All pretense gone. We can fix this privately. Richard. Please. Think about what this does to the family name, to the company's reputation if this goes public. Richard looked at her steadily. You should have thought about that before you framed my daughter for something you and Tyler actually did. She left the room then, Tyler trailing behind her, neither looking back at the family they'd spent 5 years embedding themselves within. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Nobody moved to stop them. The silence that followed felt heavy but clean somehow, like a held breath finally released after months of suffocating tension. Richard turned to me slowly. 30 relatives watching the reunion unfold with the same intensity they'd watched the accusation 2 months earlier. Emily. I know sorry doesn't undo what I put you through. Standing up there, humiliating you in front of everyone, without even looking at your evidence first. I was wrong. Completely. Inexcusably wrong. And I'm ashamed of it. You were, I said honestly, not ready to smooth it over just because the truth had finally arrived. You chose her word over mine without even asking to see what I'd found. That hurt more than the accusation itself. Honestly. He nodded, accepting it without argument. Something humbled in his posture I'd rarely seen from my proud, stubborn father. I want to make it right, he said. However long that takes. Starting with reinstating you fully at the company, effective today, and making sure everyone here understands exactly what actually happened, not just the version Denise fed us at Thanksgiving. He turned to address the room. I owe all of you, and especially Emily, a real apology. Aunt Carol stood up first, moving to hug me tightly, followed by Patricia, then Marcus, then relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, each offering some version of apology or support they hadn't found the courage to voice 2 months earlier. It wasn't perfect closure, but it was something real. Something earned through evidence rather than assumed through family loyalty alone. Whitfield caught my eye across the room and gave a small, satisfied nod before returning to his papers, moving the gathering finally toward the actual will reading Eleanor had intended all along. The controlling company shares now formally, undeniably mine. Secured not by favoritism but by the exact integrity my grandmother had always trusted me to demonstrate. In the days following that reckoning, word spread quickly through the county about what had happened at the Carter farmhouse. Denise's dissolved LLC from years earlier resurfaced in local news coverage once the district attorney's office confirmed an active fraud investigation, and reporters started calling the family business, asking for comment on the unfolding scandal involving forged financial documents. Richard handled the press inquiries directly this time, refusing to let anyone else speak for the family, refusing especially to let silence or vague statements protect Denise the way his earlier trust had. My daughter was wrongly accused based on fraudulent evidence, he told the local paper plainly. She's been fully reinstated, and the actual culprits are facing legal consequences. Tyler's gambling debts, once exposed, revealed an even messier picture than we'd initially uncovered. A pattern stretching back nearly 2 years. Multiple bookies, a previous eviction from an apartment he claimed to still be living in. Denise had apparently been covering for him far longer than the company fraud alone suggested, digging herself deeper with every desperate fix. Sophia helped me formally document everything for the ongoing investigation, working alongside the forensic accountant, the district attorney's office assigned to the case. "You built a better case than half the professionals I've worked with," the assigned investigator told me during one meeting, and something in that small acknowledgement felt like its own quiet, hard-earned vindication. Carol, the original bookkeeper Denise had pushed out, reached out once news broke, tearful on the phone. "I always wondered why they let me go so suddenly," she said. "I noticed things looking wrong before I left, but I second-guessed myself. I told her we'd be reaching out formally about returning to the company. If she wanted to. She did want to. And within weeks Carol was back managing the books alongside me. Her 15 years of institutional knowledge invaluable in untangling exactly how deep Denise's fee manipulation had actually run. Together we found additional discrepancies neither of us had caught individually, adding months of documented fraud to what Sophia and I had already uncovered before Christmas. My father, meanwhile, seemed to age visibly through January, the weight of his own blindness settling into him in ways that softened his usual gruffness. He started calling every Sunday again, like before Denise, except now the calls felt different, tinged with a careful humility he hadn't carried in years. He asked questions instead of assuming answers. "I keep thinking about how easily I believed the worst about you," he admitted during one call, voice heavy. 30 years of knowing you, and one manipulative woman's word was enough to override all of it in a single conversation. "I don't understand how I let that happen, Emily. I think about it constantly, and I hate the answer. I didn't have easy comfort to offer him. Not fully. Not yet. I think you were tired, and grieving your mom. And she made herself easy to lean on," I said honestly. "That doesn't excuse what happened. But I understand it a little better now than I did standing in that dining room getting humiliated in front of everyone." The company itself required serious restructuring once the full scope of the fraud became clear, renegotiated vendor contracts, an outside audit of every financial process from the past 2 years, new internal controls requiring dual authorization on any transfer above $5,000. I threw myself into the work, grateful for concrete tasks amid the emotional wreckage still settling around us. Eleanor's rental properties, once probate fully closed in February, transferred according to her original wishes, unaffected by the scandal since she'd kept those assets entirely separate from the company shares she'd used as her deliberate test. I inherited 2 properties outright, modest but meaningful, tangible proof of a grandmother who had trusted me long before anyone else finally caught up. Denise's legal troubles deepened through the winter as investigators uncovered the full pattern connecting her current fraud to the earlier dissolved LLC, which turned out to have similarly defrauded a different family years before she'd ever met my father. She'd essentially run this exact scheme once already, refined it, and brought it directly into our lives afterward. Reading about her previous victims in the investigator's report was its own strange gut punch. A widow in her 60s, a small family restaurant, both drained through eerily similar inflated fee structures before Denise moved on entirely unpunished, free to find her next target. My family had simply been the latest chapter in a pattern nobody had stopped in time. Tyler, facing his own separate charges for the gambling-related fraud and forged documents, eventually agreed to a plea deal that required restitution and probation in exchange for cooperating fully with investigators regarding his mother's broader scheme. His cooperation ultimately strengthened the case against Denise significantly, whatever bitter irony existed in a son finally, belatedly, telling the truth. I ran into Tyler once that spring, unexpectedly, at a gas station near his new, much smaller apartment. He looked older somehow, worn down in a way that made the old resentment in me soften slightly despite everything. "I really am sorry," he said quietly, not making excuses this time. "I should have stopped it before it got this far." "You should have," I agreed. Not offering easy forgiveness but not withholding basic humanity either. I hope you actually get help for the gambling, Tyler. Not because you owe me that, but because you deserve better than the life this has been building toward. He nodded. Something like genuine gratitude flickering across his tired face before we parted ways. Richard began attending family therapy that spring, something I never imagined my stoic, old-fashioned father agreeing to, let alone actively pursuing. I need to understand why I trusted the wrong person so completely, he told me once, and why I doubted you so quickly when it mattered most. I don't want to become someone who makes that mistake again. Our relationship rebuilt slowly, unevenly, through small consistent gestures rather than one dramatic reconciliation, Sunday dinners that felt genuine again, him actually asking my opinion on company decisions and listening to the answer, small apologies offered without me having to extract them first. Trust. I was learning. Rebuilt in inches, not in single sweeping moments of forgiveness. Marcus and I grew closer through the whole ordeal too, working construction sites together while Carol and I overhauled the accounting systems from the ground up. I should have stood up harder at Thanksgiving, he told me once. I've thought about that a lot. I let the room's momentum carry me instead of trusting what I actually believed. You did more than most people in that room, I told him honestly, remembering him half rising from his chair before his mother pulled him back down. It's easy to imagine being braver after the fact. In the moment, 30 relatives all staying silent together creates a kind of pressure that's hard to push against alone, even when you know something's wrong. Aunt Carol became something like a second mother to me through that spring, checking in constantly, insisting I come for Sunday lunches even on weeks I saw my father separately. Family isn't really about blood, she told me once, stirring gravy at her stove. It's about who shows up consistently, honestly, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient to do so. The company slowly stabilized through the following months, contracts steadying, employee morale improving once word spread that the fraud had been fully addressed and the actual culprits held accountable rather than swept quietly under the rug the way family scandals so often were. New clients even mentioned respecting how transparently we'd handled the entire public reckoning. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely enjoying the expanded responsibility that came with controlling those company shares Eleanor had left me. Not because of power for its own sake, but because I finally had the authority to build the kind of transparent, careful financial culture she'd always modeled for me growing up in her sunroom. Whitfield and I stayed in touch beyond the formal estate business, occasionally grabbing coffee to discuss company matters or simply catch up. Eleanor would be proud of how you handled all this, he told me once. Not just finding the truth, but handling the aftermath with grace instead of vindictiveness. That's harder than the investigation itself. Honestly, I thought often that spring about Eleanor's careful, patient trap, how she'd built contingencies without accusing anyone prematurely, how she trusted evidence and character to eventually align rather than forcing an outcome through favoritism alone. Felt like one final lesson from her, delivered posthumously, about patience, precision, and letting truth do the heavy lifting eventually. My mother's old friend Patricia mentioned once that Eleanor had spoken to her, near the very end, about specific worries regarding Denise's influence over Richard. She said she trusted you'd figure it out. If it ever came to that, Patricia told me. She said you were the only one in the family who actually read the fine print. That phrase, echoing back through Patricia's memory of Eleanor's own words, settled something in me that had felt unresolved since the day Whitfield first showed me those handwritten notes. My grandmother hadn't just left me evidence. She'd left me a specific, deliberate vote of confidence, trusting my particular strengths to eventually protect the family she loved fiercely until the end. Sophia and I celebrated quietly once the district attorney's office confirmed formal charges against Denise that April: fraud, forgery, and grand theft, alongside additional charges connected to her previous victims once investigators built the full pattern of her history. You did this, Sophia reminded me. Not luck. Not just Eleanor's planning. Your own persistence found this truth. I appreciated the reminder, because it would have been easy to attribute everything to Eleanor's foresight alone. Forgetting the sleepless nights, the painstaking document review, the courage it took walking back into that farmhouse for the will reading, knowing exactly what I was about to unleash on a family gathering still raw from Thanksgiving's public humiliation. Richard offered, that summer, to formally name me company president, a title he'd always assumed would eventually go to a son he'd never had, or perhaps to Tyler, before everything unraveled so completely. You've earned this the hard way, he said. And honestly, you understand this business better than I ever gave you credit for. I accept it, though not without acknowledging the strange, bittersweet path that had led here. A public humiliation, months of isolation, a grandmother's careful posthumous trap, all converging toward a position I'd always quietly wanted but never expected to receive through circumstances this painful and this thoroughly, undeniably vindicating in the end. The company held a small ceremony that August. Employees and family gathered in the same farmhouse backyard where 30 relatives had once watched me get grounded like a child. This time, the same backyard filled with genuine applause as Richard formally handed over leadership, his voice steady and proud in a way that finally matched his words. My daughter built this recovery from nothing, he told the gathered crowd. After I failed her completely when she needed me most. I'm not proud of how I handled last Thanksgiving. I am deeply, enormously proud of everything she's built since then, entirely on her own merit and hard work. I felt tears finally, genuinely, of the good kind. Denise's trial proceedings continued through the fall, ultimately resulting in a plea agreement given the overwhelming forensic evidence, restitution payments, though most of the money proved unrecoverable, alongside a prison sentence that felt, to the whole family, like appropriate accountability finally arriving after years of her exploiting trusting people's grief and goodwill for personal gain. Tyler completed his probation requirements and, according to occasional updates through mutual acquaintances, entered a gambling addiction treatment program voluntarily, something none of us expected but that felt like genuine, hopeful growth rather than the desperate excuse-making he'd offered during the initial reveal. I found myself quietly hoping he actually followed through with it. My father and I continued rebuilding steadily through that year. Our relationship stronger in some ways than it had been even before Denise entered our lives, tempered now by an honesty neither of us had practiced consistently before the crisis forced it. He apologized again on the anniversary of that Thanksgiving, unprompted, simply because he still carried it. I think about that dinner table every year now, he told me. Every Thanksgiving. I'll remember standing up and choosing the wrong version of events over my own daughter. I hope someday it stops hurting to remember. But honestly, I think it probably shouldn't. Entirely. Some mistakes deserve to stay uncomfortable in memory. I disagreed gently, telling him healing required eventually setting some of that weight down, not carrying every mistake forever as penance. You've shown me, consistently, for a year now, that you learned from it, I said. That matters more than perpetual guilt. Eleanor would want us both moving forward, building something good from what happened, not just mourning it. Carol retired quietly the following spring, confident in the systems we'd rebuilt together, training a new hire thoroughly before she left. You've got sharper eyes than half the accountants I worked with over 30 years, she told me at her retirement lunch. Eleanor trained you well, even if she didn't always call it training at the time. I thought about that often, how much of what saved this family had actually been quietly built years earlier. In Eleanor's sunroom, teaching a grieving 16-year-old to balance a checkbook, to read fine print carefully, to trust evidence over easy assumptions. She hadn't just left me a trap for Denise. She'd spent years preparing me to spring it correctly. By the following Thanksgiving, one full year after the humiliation that started everything, the Carter farmhouse filled again with relatives, casserole dishes, and the same long gravel driveway lined with cars. This time, though, the atmosphere felt entirely different, lighter, more honest. built on a foundation that had actually been tested and found solid rather than merely assumed. Richard stood at the head of the table again, tapping his glass with a fork the same way he had the year before. And my stomach tightened instinctively despite everything that had changed since then. But his expression this time held none of the rigid tension from before. Only warmth. And something like nervous anticipation I couldn't quite place yet. Last year, at this exact table, he began, voice steady. I made the worst mistake of my life, publicly and cruelly, against the person who's proven, every single day since, to deserve better than that moment. 30 relatives, many of the same faces from the year before, went quiet. Watching him with careful attention, I want to formally say, in front of everyone who witnessed what happened last year, that Emily was right, that I was wrong, and that this company, this family, exists today in far better shape because of her integrity and her refusal to accept an injustice quietly. He raised his glass toward me, eyes glistening. To Emily. Genuinely. Deservedly. The table erupted into applause, warmer and louder than any toast I'd witnessed at that farmhouse before. Aunt Carol wiping tears openly, Marcus grinning from across the table. Even distant relatives I barely knew joining in with genuine warmth rather than the awkward, complicit silence from the year prior. I felt something settle fully into place inside me. I stood briefly, unprepared for a speech but feeling the moment required something. Last year was the hardest year of my life, I said honestly. But it taught me something important, that the truth, given enough time and enough persistence, usually finds its way to the surface. I'm grateful to everyone who believed me, even quietly, even when it was hard. I looked toward Whitfield, seated near the end of the table as an honored guest, someone Eleanor had trusted enough to build her careful contingency plan through. He raised his own glass slightly toward me, a small acknowledgement between us of everything Eleanor's patient foresight had ultimately accomplished, protecting a family from a threat she'd seen coming clearly. After dinner, Aunt Carol pulled me aside near the kitchen, pressing a small wrapped box into my hands. Your grandmother wanted you to have this eventually, she said. I've been holding on to it since the funeral, waiting for the right moment. I think this is finally it. Inside was Eleanor's own reading glasses, worn and familiar, resting on faded velvet. She always said you had her eyes for numbers, Carol told me, smiling through tears. I think she meant it more literally than we realized at the time. I held the glasses carefully, overwhelmed by the quiet, deliberate love embedded in that small gesture. One more piece of evidence that Eleanor had planned every detail with remarkable, loving precision. Later that evening, walking through the same backyard where the company handover ceremony had happened months earlier, Richard found me sitting alone on the porch steps, watching relatives' laughter drift out through lit windows behind us. He sat down beside me quietly, neither of us speaking for a while, comfortable in a silence we'd earned honestly. I keep wondering, he said eventually, what would have happened if your grandmother hadn't built that contingency? If you hadn't had the resources or the persistence to fight back the way you did? I considered the question seriously. I think the truth would have come out eventually anyway. Denise's overconfidence would have caught up with her regardless. Maybe, Richard said. But it would have taken longer. And you would have suffered longer for something you never did. I don't want to imagine that version of things too closely. It makes me too aware of how close we came to losing something we can't easily get back. Even with everything that's been repaired since then. We didn't lose it, I told him, meaning it fully now. A year of consistent rebuilding behind those words rather than easy forgiveness offered too quickly. It got tested. Badly. And it survived. That's different from losing something, Dad. That's actually stronger, in a way, than if it had never been tested at all. He pulled me into a hug then, the kind I hadn't received from him consistently since before my mother died, before Denise, before any of it. I love you, Emily. I should say that more often. And mean it through my actions more consistently. Not just during crisis moments when everything's already falling apart around us. You're doing that now, I said. And that matters more than perfect consistency. Nobody gets this stuff exactly right all the time, Dad. What matters is showing up. Honestly. When it counts. And actually learning from the moments you got wrong instead of just apologizing and repeating the same mistakes eventually. Sophia joined me on the porch a while later. Having become something like an honorary family member herself after everything we'd been through together. Your dad seems different, she observed. Watching him through the window. Laughing genuinely with Marcus over something at the dinner table. Good different. Like whatever broke actually got set properly this time. It did, I agreed. Feeling the truth of it settle comfortably in my chest. It took a lot of pain to get here. But I think we actually built something more honest than what existed before all of this happened. Sometimes things have to break completely before they can be rebuilt correctly. On stronger foundations than before. The company itself thrived through that year. New contracts flowing in partly because of the transparency we built into every process. Partly because word spread about how thoroughly we'd addressed the fraud instead of quietly burying it, the way so many family businesses might have chosen to handle similar embarrassing situations privately. Carol's replacement, a sharp young accountant named Priya, mentioned once that she'd taken the job specifically because of how publicly and thoroughly we'd handled the scandal. It told me this was a place that actually valued honesty over comfortable silence, she said. That's rare. Especially in family businesses where loyalty often outweighs accountability. I thought about that observation often. How the worst chapter of my life had ultimately built something better than what existed before it. A company culture rooted in transparency rather than assumption. A family relationship with my father rebuilt on honest accountability rather than the comfortable, unexamined dynamic that had made Denise's manipulation possible in the first place. Eleanor's grave, which I visited regularly, felt different to sit beside that second Thanksgiving evening. Less like mourning and more like quiet gratitude for a woman who'd protected her family from beyond the grave through nothing more than careful observation, patient documentation, and deep trust in the granddaughter she'd spent years quietly preparing for exactly this moment. You knew, I told her headstone softly, the way I sometimes did when nobody else was around to hear it. You knew something was wrong. And instead of accusing anyone prematurely, you built me the tools to find the truth myself, on my own timeline, with evidence nobody could dismiss. That was the greatest gift you ever gave me. I thought about the word grounded sometimes, how my father had used it that Thanksgiving to mean punishment, confinement, a childish restriction imposed on an adult who'd done nothing wrong. But somewhere along this year-long journey, the word had come to mean something entirely different to me, steady, rooted, connected firmly to the truth and to people who mattered. That's what Eleanor had really left me. Beyond the properties, beyond the company shares, beyond even the careful evidence trail that eventually exposed Denise and Tyler. She'd left me grounded, in the truest sense of the word, rooted in integrity, connected to a family worth fighting for. Steady enough to weather a storm that could have destroyed someone less prepared. As the second Thanksgiving evening wound down, relatives slowly departing with hugs and promises to visit sooner than the usual once-a-year gathering, I stood in the farmhouse doorway watching taillights disappear down the same gravel driveway where I'd once sat crying in my car, humiliated and alone, wondering if anyone would ever believe me. Someone had believed me. Eventually. Eleanor had believed in me long before anyone else caught up. Sophia had believed in me from the very first conversation. And Carol. Marcus. Even Whitfield in his careful, professional way. They'd all eventually stood beside the truth once it had the evidence to support it. And that, ultimately, had been enough. 6 months after that second Thanksgiving, Denise's sentencing hearing finally concluded, the judge citing the pattern of repeated fraud against multiple families as an aggravating factor justifying a longer sentence than her lawyer had argued for. I attended the hearing, not for satisfaction exactly, but for the closure of watching the full legal process reach its conclusion. She looked smaller in the courtroom than she ever had at our family gatherings, stripped of the confident warmth she'd used so effectively to manipulate an entire family for years. She didn't look at me once during the proceedings, her gaze fixed somewhere on the middle distance, as though refusing to acknowledge the person who'd ultimately unraveled her scheme. The judge's final words stayed with me long after leaving the courthouse. The defendant exploited grief, trust, and family loyalty for personal financial gain, repeatedly, across multiple victims, showing no remorse until confronted with overwhelming evidence. Felt like an official, undeniable confirmation of everything I'd fought to prove that Christmas at the farmhouse. Richard sat beside me throughout the hearing, his hand finding mine during the sentencing itself, a small, steady gesture that meant more than words could have in that sterile courtroom. Afterward, walking to the parking lot together, he finally said what I think we'd both been feeling. "It's really over now. All of it. Completely." "It is," I agreed, feeling something genuinely lighter settle over me for the first time since that Thanksgiving accusation nearly 18 months earlier. The forgery, the humiliation, the isolation, the painstaking investigation, the public reveal, all of it had reached its natural, legal conclusion, leaving behind consequences appropriately matched to the harm actually caused. The company continued thriving under my leadership through that following year, expanding into commercial contracts we'd never pursued before, hiring additional staff, even opening a second office in a neighboring county. Richard stepped back gradually into a consulting role, proud but no longer needing to control every decision the way he once had before everything happened. "You've built something better than I ever could have alone," he told me during one of our now regular Sunday dinners. "I used to think building this company was my legacy. I think I understand now that raising someone capable of protecting it, honestly and skillfully, when it mattered most, was actually the more important accomplishment all along." I found myself, that second year, mentoring young employees the way Eleanor had once mentored me, teaching careful attention to detail, patient documentation, the value of trusting evidence over easy assumptions. Priya became something like a protege, sharp and thorough, reminding me constantly of the quiet, careful woman who'd first taught me these exact same principles. Marcus eventually took over site management entirely, his steady, grounded presence exactly what the company needed as it expanded. We grew close as genuine friends through that period. Not just cousins connected by blood, but people who'd weathered something difficult together and come out the other side with mutual, hard-earned respect for each other's character. Aunt Carol hosted Sunday dinners regularly now, a tradition that had somehow outlasted the original crisis that sparked closer family bonds in its aftermath. Sometimes the worst things that happen to a family end up revealing who actually deserves to be part of it, she told me once, stirring her famous gravy the way she always did. I thought about Tyler occasionally, wondering how his recovery was progressing, whether the treatment program had genuinely helped him build a different life than the desperate, debt-ridden path that had led him toward covering for his mother's fraud in the first place. Mutual acquaintances mentioned he'd moved to a different state, working steadily, staying largely out of trouble. Part of me hoped that was true, genuinely, without needing it confirmed constantly. He'd been young and cornered and made terrible choices under pressure, different in kind from his mother's calculated, repeated exploitation of trusting families. I could hold both truths simultaneously, accountability for what he'd done, and hope that he'd eventually build something better afterward. Denise's case became something of a cautionary tale locally, mentioned in local business circles as a reminder to implement stronger financial controls, dual authorization requirements, independent audits even within trusted family structures. Several other local businesses reached out that year, asking Carol and me to consult on strengthening their own internal safeguards against similar exploitation. "It's strange," I told Sophia during one of these consulting sessions, "turning the worst experience of my life into something that actually helps other families avoid the same thing." She smiled, adjusting her laptop. That's not strange, Emily. That's exactly what resilience looks like when it's done right. Building something useful from something painful. Whitfield retired that following spring, handing his practice over to a younger partner but staying involved with our family's affairs informally. Something closer to old friend than professional advisor at that point. Eleanor would be so proud, he told me during his retirement dinner. Of everything you built from the foundation she left you. She built the foundation, I corrected gently. I just had the persistence to actually use it properly when the moment came. He shook his head, smiling. That persistence is exactly what she was counting on, Emily. She knew the evidence alone wouldn't matter without someone willing to fight for the truth it revealed. That was always the real test. Standing at his retirement party, surrounded by people who'd become genuinely important to me through this entire ordeal. Sophia, Carol, Marcus. My father. I felt a profound gratitude for how thoroughly my life had rebuilt itself from what had once felt like complete public devastation at that Thanksgiving table 18 months earlier. Richard raised a toast that evening, unprompted, echoing something similar to what he'd said at that second Thanksgiving dinner. To the people who stick around and do the hard work of rebuilding trust, even when it would be easier to walk away or stay bitter. He looked at me specifically, especially to my daughter, who never stopped fighting for the truth. Thought, watching him, about how different this version of my father was from the man who'd stood up at that dining room table and grounded me like a child in front of 30 relatives. Not a different person exactly, but a more honest one, tempered by consequences, humbled enough to actually change rather than just apologize repeatedly. That change mattered more to me than any single apology could have, because it proved the reconciliation wasn't performance, wasn't just guilt-driven gestures meant to smooth over discomfort. It was genuine, demonstrated repeatedly through a year and a half of consistent actions, Sunday dinners, honest conversations, real accountability rather than empty words offered once and forgotten. The farmhouse itself eventually passed formally into my name as well, part of Eleanor's broader estate planning that had always intended it to anchor future generations of the family, a physical space for exactly the kind of gatherings that had witnessed both my worst humiliation and my most complete vindication within the very same walls. I renovated the sunroom that year, careful to preserve its essential character, the same window seat where Eleanor had taught me to balance a checkbook, the same slightly uneven floorboard near the door, updated just enough to remain functional for another generation while honoring exactly the space where this entire story had quietly, patiently begun. Sophia helped me set up a small home office there eventually, joking that it felt appropriate given everything the room had indirectly made possible. This is where Eleanor basically trained her successor, she said, only half joking. It makes sense this is where you'd want to keep working. Honestly, given everything this place represents now. My father visited often that year, sometimes just to sit in that sunroom quietly, processing everything that had happened within the broader arc of our family's history. I used to think this room was just your grandmother's quiet space, he told me once. I understand now it was actually a classroom, teaching lessons none of us fully appreciated in time. She was preparing me, I said, for exactly this. Not that she could have predicted the specific details, but she understood people well enough to recognize the kind of threat someone like Denise represented, long before the rest of us caught up to what was actually happening right in front of us. 2 years after that original Thanksgiving, the family gathered again at the farmhouse, the tradition fully restored to something warmer and more honest than it had been even before Denise entered our lives. 30 relatives filled the same dining room, casserole dishes steaming, laughter genuine rather than the careful, performed warmth from years before all of this. Richard stood to give the traditional toast, this time without the tension that had marked both previous years' versions of this exact moment. I'm grateful, he said simply, for a family that survived something that could have destroyed us, and for a daughter whose integrity ultimately protected everyone at this table, whether they realized it at the time or not. I looked around the table at faces that had witnessed both my humiliation and my eventual vindication. Aunt Carol, Marcus, Patricia. Cousins and second cousins who'd stayed silent during the accusation but found their voices afterward. All of them now part of a family history that included both the failure and the eventual, hard-earned repair. Whitfield. Still an honored guest at these gatherings even in retirement, caught my eye from across the table and raised his glass slightly. A small private acknowledgement of everything Eleanor's careful foresight had ultimately accomplished for a family she'd loved fiercely enough to protect even after she was no longer physically present to do it herself. After dinner, I found myself back on the porch steps where Richard and I had talked that second Thanksgiving evening, watching another year's worth of relatives depart down the same gravel driveway, taillights disappearing into the darkness the same way they always had, except everything about how I experienced that image had fundamentally changed by now. I thought about the phone call that had started everything, Richard's voice sharp and accusing over a spreadsheet I'd brought him in good faith, hoping we could solve a problem together the way we always had before Denise entered our lives. I thought about how differently that story could have ended without Eleanor's careful, patient planning, but it hadn't ended that way, and I'd stopped dwelling on the alternate versions of events that never actually happened. What mattered was what had actually occurred. A public humiliation transformed, through persistence and evidence and a grandmother's foresight, into a complete vindication and a genuinely stronger, more honest family than had existed before any of it. Marcus joined me on the porch steps, handing me a cup of coffee the way he had countless times through this entire ordeal. "Remember when you said we'd all regret not listening to you?" he said, smiling. "You were right about that, obviously. But I don't think any of us regret where we ended up. Honestly. Eventually." "Neither do I," I said, and meant it fully, without reservation. For the first time since that original Thanksgiving accusation had upended everything I thought I understood about my family, my father's trust, and the fragile, precious nature of reputation built over decades and nearly destroyed in a single, careless public moment. Priya called me late that evening, apologizing for interrupting the holiday, but excited about a new contract the company had just secured, one of the largest in Carter & Sons history. "Eleanor would be thrilled," Richard said when I told him, joining me on the porch again with his own cup of coffee, watching stars emerge overhead. "She built something that survived betrayal and came out stronger," he said. "That's not luck, Emily. That's the direct result of the values she instilled in you. And honestly, the values I'm still learning to fully embody myself, even at my age. Watching my own daughter demonstrate them more consistently than I ever quite managed." "You're doing better," I told him honestly. "Every single day. Actually, that matters more than getting it perfectly right from the start. Nobody does that, Dad. What matters is exactly this: showing up, staying honest, actually changing when the evidence shows you were wrong about something important." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer. The farmhouse behind us finally quiet after a full day of family gathered under one roof, genuinely connected rather than merely performing connection for appearances. 2 years earlier, I couldn't have imagined this particular piece existing again between us. Not after that devastating public accusation. Eleanor's reading glasses sat on my desk in the renovated sunroom now, a permanent fixture beside my own work materials, a quiet daily reminder of exactly whose careful foresight had ultimately protected this family from a threat none of us had recognized clearly enough in time, until the evidence finally, undeniably spoke for itself. Thought, closing my eyes briefly on that porch step, about everything the past 2 years had taught me that truth, however slow to surface, usually finds its way eventually if someone persists long enough to uncover it properly. That family, tested honestly, can rebuild stronger than before. That grounding, done right, means rootedness, not punishment. Richard finished his coffee and stood, offering me a hand up from the porch steps the way he used to when I was small. Before any of this happened, before Denise, before the accusation, before everything that had tested and ultimately proven the strength of what actually mattered between us as father and daughter. Same time next year, he said, echoing an old family tradition that predated everything difficult we'd survived together. Same time next year, I agreed, following him back inside toward the warm, lit windows of a farmhouse that had witnessed both the worst and the best of what our family had ultimately proven itself capable of becoming. 6 months later, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Whitfield's old office, written by Denise from prison, requesting a meeting. I sat with the request for nearly 2 weeks before deciding, finally, that closure sometimes required facing the person who'd caused the harm directly, on my own terms, in a controlled setting. The visiting room was sparse, fluorescent lit, nothing like the warm farmhouse gatherings where she'd once orchestrated my public humiliation with such calculated precision. She looked older, thinner, stripped entirely of the polished confidence that had once made her so effective at manipulating an entire trusting family for her own desperate financial gain. I wanted to apologize, she said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes at first. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because I've had a lot of time to think about what I actually did to you. Publicly. Deliberately. To protect myself and Tyler at your expense. I waited, saying nothing, letting her finish. You were an easy target, she admitted, something almost like shame crossing her face. Eleanor's favorite. Close with your father. Financially responsible in ways that made you convenient to frame. I told myself it was just business, just protecting my son. But I knew exactly what I was doing to you and your reputation that day. You knew, I repeated. And you did it anyway. In front of 30 people who'd known me my whole life. She nodded slowly. I did. I'm not asking you to understand it or excuse it. I just needed to say it out loud to you directly. Finally. Instead of hiding behind lawyers and denials the whole time. I sat with her admission for a long moment, feeling something complicated settle in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But something closer to acknowledgement that the person who'd hurt me so publicly finally understood. Fully and completely. The actual weight of what she'd done to me and to this entire family. I don't forgive you, I said honestly. Not yet. Maybe not ever fully. But I appreciate you saying this directly instead of continuing to deny it the way you did in that courtroom. She nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. Something humbled and genuinely different from the calculating woman I remembered from that Thanksgiving table. How's my father doing? She asked, almost hesitant. Some remnant of genuine feeling apparently surviving beneath everything else that had happened between them. He's doing well, I said simply, offering nothing more personal than that basic fact. She nodded, seeming to understand she'd forfeited the right to deeper details about his life. And Tyler, she asked next, voice catching slightly. He's doing better, I told her, which was true as far as I knew from occasional updates through mutual acquaintances. He's getting help. I hope he continues building something real instead of falling back into the patterns that got both of you here in the first place. Thank you for telling me that, she said, something genuinely grateful in her voice for the first time during our entire conversation. I worry about him constantly. I know I don't deserve updates about your family anymore. But thank you anyway. For that small mercy. Whatever it's actually worth to either of us now. I left the visiting room feeling lighter somehow. Not because I'd found forgiveness exactly, but because I'd finally faced the person who'd caused so much damage and found her diminished, human, capable of genuine remorse rather than the calculating manipulator I'd built up in my memory over the past 2 years. Driving home, I called Sophia to tell her about the visit. How do you feel? She asked. Complicated, I admitted. Not healed exactly, but maybe closer to it than before. I think closure isn't always one clean moment. Sometimes it's just facing something difficult directly, and finding you can actually survive the encounter intact. I told my father about the visit that Sunday, uncertain how he'd react to learning I'd seen Denise directly. He listened quietly, processing. I'm glad you got whatever you needed from that conversation, he said finally. I don't think I'm ready to face her myself yet. But I understand why you might have needed to. I'm not sure I needed it, I said honestly. I think I just wanted to see for myself whether she'd actually changed, or whether she was still performing something calculated even from prison. I think what I found was somewhere in between genuine remorse, but also someone who'll probably always struggle with honesty fundamentally. That distinction mattered to me. Walking away from the encounter, the difference between someone capable of real growth and someone simply performing contrition because circumstances forced her hand. I couldn't know for certain which version of Denise I'd actually encountered that day, and ultimately, I decided that uncertainty didn't need to control my own healing process. Life continued steadily from there. The company thriving. My relationship with my father deepening year over year. The farmhouse hosting increasingly warm, honest gatherings that bore little resemblance to the tense, performed harmony that had existed during Denise's 5 years within the family before everything finally, completely unraveled that Thanksgiving. I thought sometimes about the version of myself who'd sat crying in her car that original Thanksgiving night, humiliated and uncertain whether anyone would ever believe her. I wished I could tell her what was coming, not to rush through the pain, but to trust that persistence, evidence, and Eleanor's careful foresight would eventually prevail. 3 years after that original accusation, I stood again in the same dining room, this time preparing to host Thanksgiving myself for the first time. Richard insisting I take over hosting duties now that I owned the farmhouse formally. It feels right, he said. Having you host in the space Eleanor loved so much. I spent the morning cooking Eleanor's sweet potato recipe from memory, the same dish Denise had once made in her honor with such calculated, hollow performance. Making it myself, genuinely, felt like reclaiming something small but meaningful, a tradition restored to its authentic purpose, rather than weaponized for someone else's manipulative agenda. 30 relatives arrived again that afternoon, filling the same gravel driveway, the same warm farmhouse rooms, carrying the same casserole dishes and folding chairs as always. But the atmosphere felt entirely transformed, built now on 3 years of demonstrated honesty and accountability, rather than the careful performance that had characterized gatherings during Denise's tenure. Richard stood to give the toast this time, insisting despite my role as host that some traditions deserved continuity. 3 years ago, this table. I made the worst decision of my life. He began. The same opening he'd used the year before, though the room no longer tensed with old anxiety hearing it. Today, I want to talk instead about what we built afterward, he continued. A company stronger than before, a family more honest than before, and a daughter who taught this entire family that persistence and integrity eventually outlast even the most calculated deception. To Emily, and to everyone who helped rebuild what was nearly lost. The applause that followed felt different from even the previous year's version, not just relief or apology, but genuine celebration of something actively, continuously built rather than merely repaired once and left alone. I felt Eleanor's presence keenly in that moment, certain she would have approved of exactly this outcome. After dinner, sitting once more on the porch steps with my father, I mentioned something that had been on my mind for months. I want to start a scholarship, I said, in Eleanor's name, for young accountants studying forensic finance. Something that honors what she actually taught me, beyond just the company and the properties. Richard's eyes lit up at the suggestion. She'd love that, he said immediately. Something that helps other people learn to read the fine print. The way she taught you. That feels like exactly the kind of legacy she'd want. Honestly. More than any building or business could represent on its own. We established the Eleanor Carter Scholarship for Forensic Accounting the following spring, funded partly through company profits and partly through my own inheritance, designed specifically to train young accountants in the careful, patient detective work that had ultimately saved our family from a threat we'd nearly failed to see clearly in time. 2 years after establishing it, the scholarship had funded 12 students, several of whom went on to work in fraud investigation, carrying forward exactly the kind of careful, principled attention to detail that Eleanor had modeled for me in her sunroom decades earlier. and that had ultimately protected our entire family from lasting devastation. Carter and Sons Construction celebrated its most profitable year yet that same year. Built on transparent processes, rebuilt trust with vendors and clients, and a leadership structure that finally matched the values the company had always claimed to hold, but hadn't consistently practiced until crisis forced genuine, lasting accountability throughout every level of the business. My father, older now but genuinely at peace in ways he hadn't been even before Denise, spent his retirement mentoring young people through the scholarship program, telling his own story honestly at fundraising events, using his very public mistake as a teaching tool for other families about the danger of choosing comfort over honest evidence. Standing in Eleanor's sunroom one quiet evening, wearing her old reading glasses out of habit more than necessity, I thought about the strange, difficult path that had led here, a public grounding meant to shame me, transformed eventually into the foundation for everything genuinely good that had followed in the years since. The word grounded had once meant humiliation, confinement, an unjust punishment delivered in front of 30 relatives who'd stayed silent while I stood accused. Now it meant something entirely different to me: rootedness, integrity, the steady foundation Eleanor had spent years quietly building into me, long before anyone understood exactly why it would eventually matter so completely. I closed the ledger on my desk that evening, the numbers finally, fully balanced after everything this family had survived together, and allowed myself, for the first time in years, to simply feel grateful for Eleanor's foresight, for evidence that eventually spoke louder than lies, and for a family truly, honestly rebuilt. Fendi.